Bonjour tout le monde, good afternoon everybody. Je m'appelle Guy Laforêt, je suis le président de la Fédération des sciences humaines du Canada, and I'm quite pleased to welcome you all here this afternoon for today's Big Thinking lecture. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the land on which we gather to hold Congress 2018 is Treaty 4 land, the territories of the Nehihowak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, de même que les terres ancestrales des Métis. We're quite grateful for the hard work and preparations for the week undertaken by our Congress host and partner for the Big Thinking Lectures, the University of Regina under the leadership of Vian Tymont, and we thank them and the indigenous communities in Regina for welcoming us here. J'aimerais vous signaler avant de commencer que nous proposons un service d'interprétation simultanée. Vous pourrez vous procurer des écouteurs dans la salle située à l'extérieur du théâtre. Je voudrais aussi remercier notre partenaire, nos partenaires, le Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines, la Fondation canadienne pour l'innovation, de même qu'Université Canada, pour leur parrainage de la série de causeries Voir grand. Big Thinking Series gives us a chance to engage in thoughtful conversations about pressing issues of our time and for hope towards the future. Today is no exception. We're delighted to welcome Margaret MacMillan, who will, no doubt, challenge us as she discusses the tangled history of war and society and our complicated feelings towards it and towards those who fight. Je voudrais maintenant inviter Brent Herbert Copley, vice-président exécutif du CRSH, qui fera l'introduction de Mme MacMillan. Monsieur Herbert Copley.
Thank you so much, Guy. Et bon après-midi à vous toutes et toutes. I'm really excited to be here. And on behalf of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, or SSHRC, I want to welcome you to this, the second Big Thinking Lecture at Congress 2018. Like Guy, I'd like to start by acknowledging that the land on which we're gathering today is the traditional territory of the Nahiak, the Anishinaabeg, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis. The campus is, of course, on Treaty 4 lands, and today these lands continue to be the shared territory of many diverse peoples from near and from far. Le CRSH, qui fête cette année notre 40e anniversaire, est fier d'appuyer la Fédération à l'œuvre qu'elle rassemble des chercheurs éminents et des personnalités publiques pour présenter des recherches, des idées, des solutions avant-gardistes concernant les importantes questions de notre époque. Sur la colline du Parlement tout au long de l'année et aussi ici au Congrès des sciences humaines. Je tiens à féliciter l'University of Regina et la Fédération pour avoir organisé une telle série d'événements cette semaine. Et je tiens aussi à féliciter chacun d'entre vous également. I want to congratulate all of you as well. You've really made two excellent choices, I think, at least two. First of all, you chose to come to Congress, which is always a great choice. And you've chosen to participate in today's Big Thinking Lecture, which is going to be a treat. I promise you that you're not going to be disappointed. Dr. Margaret MacMillan is, as many of you know, professor of history at the University of Toronto. She's former warden of St. Anthony's College and professor of international history at the University of Oxford. She's known to all of us in terms of her media appearances, commentary on both historical issues and also current events. And if you're like me, you probably have at least one or two well-worn and well-loved copies of Margaret's books on your bookshelf somewhere. She was, among other things, the first woman to earn the Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction for her book Paris 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World. That book also won the Duff Cooper Prize, the Hessel Tiltman Prize for History, the Arthur Ross Book Award, and the Governor General's Prize for Nonfiction. And on top of that, it was a New York Times Editor's Choice in 2002. Her other books include Nixon in China, The War That Ended Peace, The Uses and Abuses of History, and most recently, History's People, Personalities in the Past. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. She's a Senior Fellow at Massey College at U of T, and Honorary Fellow at both Trinity College at U of T and St. Hilda's College at Oxford. She's a trustee of the Rhodes Trust, sits on the board of the Mosaic Institute, and is on the editorial boards of both International History and First World War Studies. Professor MacMillan was invested as an officer of the Order of Canada in 2006, and in 2015 became a companion of the Order. Today, as Guy has mentioned, Dr. MacMillan will take us through some of that tangled history of war and society and of our really complicated feelings toward both war and toward those who fight. Elle examinera des façons dont les changements que connaît la société ont une incidence sur la nature de la guerre et comment, en retour, la guerre change la société, y compris la façon dont les femmes sont impliquées dans la guerre, soit en tant que participantes qu'en tant qu'objet. So, without further delay, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Margaret MacMillan. Dr. MacMillan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming on this beautiful sunny day to sit in the dark room and talk about a dark subject. War is something, I think, that is in our lives in ways that we don't perhaps often stop and reflect about. It's all around us. I think we're used to using metaphors that come from war. We talk about a fight to the finish. We talk about foes and friends. We talk about a war on drugs or a war on drunk driving. I was once on a book jury many years ago in Canada, and one of the titles we had was My War on My Husband's Cholesterol. It had some very boring recipes, in case you want to know. It's there in our geography. Kitchener-Waterloo in Ontario was renamed from Berlin-Potsdam during the First World War after a great British military hero and a great British victory. We have a Billy Bishop Airport in Toronto, Trafalgar Square in London, the Austerlitz railway station in Paris. Wherever you go, certainly in North America and Europe, and in South America, you'll see statues of long dead admirals and generals. And we see war memorials sometimes, I think, without really taking them in, because we see them so often. And we still have commemorative events. We have the annual wearing of poppies. We have commemorative services. We have museums that are dedicated to the history of war, including, of course, the wonderful one in Ottawa. And many people make pilgrimages, and I think in a way they are pilgrimages to battlefields, to see places where their ancestors or people they knew or people they might have known once fought. And I was struck, actually, looking at the recent wedding, which some of you may have watched in England, how many of those were wearing military uniform, including little pages who carried Meghan Markle's train. And so I think the imprint of the military and the imprint of war is there. And I think we have very complicated feelings about war. We regard it with horror, of course. We regard it as a breakdown of peace. We regard it as an aberration. We regard it as not the normal state of affairs. And I think we often deplore war, and we sometimes, I think, would prefer to avert our eyes from it. But I think we also see that war, or some of us see that war, or feel that war has a certain sort of glamour. If you think of the popularity of movies about war, if you go into bookshops and look for the sections on war, you will find that they're very large indeed. If you look, as I did recently, at one of the most popular games, electronic games, the top three all involve war. The third most popular is one based on World War II, at least according to Forbes magazine for 1918. We are, I think, conflicted in the same way about those who fight. We regard them as people who aren't like us. How can they go and fight? How can they want to break the norms of society? How can they want to kill others when we are brought up not to kill and not to want to hurt others? But we also, I think, admire them in a certain way. We recognize that they do things that perhaps we can't, that they are brave in ways that I certainly couldn't be. And so I think we have the same complicated attitudes towards those individuals who fight as we do towards war itself. We are both repelled by it and attracted by it. Whatever we think about war, I would argue as a historian, we must study it. I think too often we've tended to see war as something which happens, we want to forget about it once it's happened, we go back to what we think is the normal state of affairs. And I just think this is wrong. I think war is deeply woven into human history and has affected our societies, continues to affect our societies, but the relationship is a two-way relationship. It is not one that goes just one way. The relationship is between war and society. War is the product of human society. As human societies change, they fight different sorts of wars. Wars, just to give you one example, before the 18th century, were very much dynastic wars. They were fought often for the purposes of their leaders, to acquire territory, to acquire status, to acquire dominance, and the peoples living in those countries had no say in whether there was a war or not. With the coming of the French Revolution, with the spread of participatory government, peoples got much more involved in the wars that their governments fought. And that changed the nature of those wars in ways which I will explain. And so it's not just war affecting society, it is society affecting war. Now, there are a number of very, very interesting arguments about the relationship between war and society. There is one argument that is very much discussed at the moment, and there is no clear conclusion, and that is that human society actually developed in part as a result of war. But again, the other side of that is, once human society began to get organized, it became more likely that it would fight wars. And the crucial change seems to have been, and it is very difficult, of course, to get the evidence for this, but the crucial change seems to have been when we stopped, as a species, being hunter-gatherers and settled down and became agriculturalists. Because what that meant is we could no longer pick up and move as easily as we could have done when we were hunter-gatherers. If we were menaced as hunter-gatherers, we could simply move away. There was enough space for us to move away. Once we had settled down, once we had established villages, again, this was many, many decades, many millennia ago, once we had established farms, once we had begun to cultivate crops, once we had begun to cultivate animals, then it became much more difficult to move away. And then it became necessary to organize ourselves in ways to protect what we had against those, perhaps still nomadic, who would come and raid from outside. And so the very growth of organization in human society seems to have been affected by the need to defend what we had. But the more we got organized, the more it was possible to use violence in an organized way. There is a view, which I'm not sure I subscribe to, but there's certainly a view that before this settlement into human agricultural colonies, that we lived in a fairly peaceable way. And I think, again, the evidence is out, but there certainly seems to be evidence that there was low-level violence, people killing each other long before we became organized. What happened once we became organized is we were able to kill and use violence on a much different sort of scale, in a much more organized way. And so I think you can argue, and I would argue, that the organization of human society and the development of organized violence really go along together. Not all societies have been violent, and not all societies have been violent in the same way. And you can certainly find examples of organized societies which have not used violence or have tried not to use violence. But if you look through the long pattern of human history, I think what you will see is a very, very close relationship between us as a species getting ourselves organized and society becoming more organized. In fact, the needs to organize for war have often driven developments in human society. The centralization of government, the increase in the taxing power of government, the involvement of government in economies, the use of human capital, to put it in that way, by governments, has often been driven by war. In the 18th century, 17th and 18th centuries, Britain's rise to power very much depended on its navy, and that navy took a great deal of organization. And so the British developed an efficient bureaucracy, really largely because they needed to get the resources out of the British economy, and they needed to acquire the materials they needed, and they need to make sure those materials were being used properly and not wasted or simply given away through corruption. They needed to use those materials effectively. As a result, they developed a stronger central government and a more effective central government. In the 19th century, as war began to expand, with the expansion of the Industrial Revolution and the growth of population, governments recognized that they needed better educated soldiers. And so a number of governments in Europe, for example, very deliberately fostered education as a way of producing good soldiers. The building of railways throughout Europe, which of course was going to have a huge impact on Europe's economic and social development, was also partly driven for military reasons. And so the relationship is not a one-way relationship. It is a relationship that is very, very deeply entangled. The other side of the relationship between human society and war is that, like it or not, we have sometimes had progress happening as a result of war. And this is something which I think, again, like war itself, is very, very uncomfortable for us. A number of the advances in our societies have come as a result of war, when resources have been used to solve particular problems. The discovery of penicillin, which has brought huge boons to humanity in dealing with disease. The discovery of penicillin was made in the 1930s, but it was not developed as a medicine until the Second World War because it was seen as simply too expensive. The willingness to invest in the development of new and expensive medicines was not there in the period before the Second World War. But once the war started, suddenly it became very, very important to try and save the soldiers who were being wounded on the battlefields, try and prevent them from dying of their wounds. There have also been improvements in the positions of particular groups in society as a result of war. The position of women has changed very significantly in the past few centuries, and that is partly because of war. The striking example, I think, which we're thinking of at the moment, because the anniversary of them getting the vote is coming up, is the giving of the vote to women in Britain and other countries after the First World War. Before the First World War, there was a very active suffrage movement, asking women themselves and their male supporters, asking for votes for women. And it was met with considerable resistance from male politicians and men in more generally in society. And the argument was made that there's no point giving the votes to women because they'll simply vote the way their husbands or their fathers tell them. And so you'll just have to count more votes and the result will be exactly the same. The other argument that was made is there's no point giving the vote to women because they really are better equipped to be in the household. They can understand how to manage a household, they can understand how to change the sheets, they can understand how to cook the meals, they can understand how to do the laundry, they can bring up the children, but they don't have the capacity emotionally or mentally or psychologically to deal with the sorts of things that men deal with. They can't go out and get jobs in the same way, they can't manage things in the same way. And what the First World War did was show that that was not true. Because during the First World War, the demand for manpower was so great, and the need for men to go off and be in uniform and go and fight in the enormous battles that were taking place meant that the jobs that had previously been done by men had to be done by women. There was no one else to do them. And so within things like driving tractors, driving railway engines, running offices, taking part in the sorts of activities which it had been said they weren't equipped to do. And at the end of the war, even those who in 1914, on the eve of the war, had opposed giving the vote to women said they've earned it. We no longer can deny it to women. And so war has, in its own way, brought progress. Now, we would not wish progress to be brought in that way, but it seems to me, one of the great paradoxes that war has fostered more organized societies, for better or for worse, and that war has, like it or not, brought progress of a sort. Now, there are many arguments about why we fight, and there's arguments about everything to do with war. There's no good definition of war itself, but the one I would use is simply the use of organized violence rather than one-on-one violence that you might get. The use of organized violence to get something that you want. And that something you want may be material, you may want loot, you may want land, you may want to steal someone else's children and families and then women. It may be something that you actually physically want to grab. That's one reason. Another reason, of course, is to defend yourself from those who would come in an organized way trying to do that to you, trying to seize what you have. Another reason, I think, which we should not downplay, is ideas. Ideology can be very powerful. In the Crusades, young men, often from families with quite significant wealth, left everything behind and went off to fight in the Middle East in an attempt to win back the holy places for Christendom. Now, we can look at those crusades and we can see what dreadful things they did, and we can see that in the end they failed, but I think we should understand that the impulse was a very real one. People really thought they were doing something. They were motivated by an ideology, and I think we understand that if we look at some of the wars that are going on today and some of the wars that went on in the 20th century. Religion is an ideology, at least in these terms, but so was socialism, so was Bolshevism. So that we do get people fighting for causes. Nationalism is a type of ideology. People are prepared to die because they believe that they're building something that will in the end be much better than what exists, and they believe that they're doing something for their particular group, their particular religion, or their particular family. I think finally we fight because of a variety of complex emotions. We fight out of fear sometimes. We fight because we fear others are about to do something to us, and so we decide to fight first. We fight sometimes because we've been humiliated, because someone has made us feel inferior. I mean, I think a very large part behind what Vladimir Putin is doing today is because of humiliation. He wants to show that Russia cannot be pushed around, and he is prepared, at least in a limited way, to actually use physical violence to try and show that Russia still counts. Or we fight for revenge, or we fight sometimes for pride. I was very struck when I was working on the outbreak of the First World War, how often those in the big capitals, in the big positions, in the ministries, the foreign ministries, in the governments, those who were in the position to make the decisions, were saying things like, we cannot back down because we will be humiliated, we will be shamed. Russia said, and they were saying in St. Petersburg, for example, before the First World War, we have to back Serbia, even if Austria attacks it, because we cannot back down. Great powers don't back down. And so I think war comes about for any number of reasons, often a complex of reasons. But what is happening, what has been happening in the past decades and past 2 centuries is war, of course, has been becoming perhaps even more deadly than it has been before. And we should not minimize the wars that happened before the 19th century. We tend to look at our huge industrial capacity, which of course is a great capacity, among other things, for killing. We tend to look at that and believe that war has been much more dreadful in the past 2 centuries. Some of the earlier wars were dreadful too, and in terms of population killed, were probably every bit as high in terms of population proportionately killed in the wars of the 19th and 20th centuries. The 30 Years' War in Germany left a devastated Germany. No one knows how many people died in that war. Perhaps 700,000 people out of a total population of 7 million. That's a very, very high death rate. And so wars in the past were bloody, were violent, were dreadful. But I think what we have seen in the 20th, 19th and 20th century is our capacity to become organized, to develop things in science and technology and industry. Unfortunately, we've seen that also becoming part of what we do to ourselves when we try to settle things by violence. What happened, I think, that was very significant at the beginning of the 19th century really were 2 things. One, a new relationship in some countries between those who were doing the governing and those who were governed. And the second thing is what I've already referred to, this enormous expansion of capacity, industrial and scientific and technological capacity. The first change was one that was being ushered in a number of countries. It was the idea that people were no longer subjects of a ruler, but were citizens of a country. And that's a very important difference. If you are the subject of a ruler, you'll tend to look at your ruler, it's his war, I will not get involved, I don't have any part in it. If I have to fight, well, I have to fight, but I'd rather not. And I think that was something that most people felt. It was the war of someone far away who wanted to fight for his or her particular reasons. What began to change, of course, were things like the American Revolution, the American War of Independence, where suddenly, and it's in the Declaration of Independence, suddenly people have a share in their government. The government belongs to them. The powers, as the Declaration of the American Declaration of Independence says, come from the consent of the governed. And this means something very important. It means that you now own your government, or you have to say a government, if you don't like it, you can get rid of it. But the other thing it means is you now have an obligation to it. You now have to fight for your government because it's your government. And so there's a very different relationship that now begins to happen. And that, of course, was given tremendous impetus by the French Revolution of 1789, when the French overthrew their government with, as you know, a great deal of violence. And what that did again was give the French a sense that they were now citizens. It was now their government. And that meant that they would have to defend it. And in 1793, France was menaced by forces from outside, by armies from Prussia and Austria, conservative powers which loathed everything that was going on in France. And they declared that the country was in danger, and they issued something called the Levée en Masse. It was a proclamation to all the French to come to the defense of the French Revolution. I'll just read you a bit of it because I think it gives you a very good sense of how that relationship is changing. From this moment until the enemy is driven from the territory of the Republic, all the French people are permanently requisitioned for the armies. The young men will go to the front, married men will forge arms and carry supplies, women will make tents and clothing, children will divide old linen into bandages, old men will be carried into the squares to rouse the courage of the soldiers, to teach hatred of the kings and the unity of the Republic. And this is really a dramatic change in the ways in which societies look on the need to defend themselves and their own obligations. And this led to a change in the attitudes of societies to those who actually went forward. In the 18th century, you would have pub signs in England, but you'd also have similar things in France, saying no dogs, no beggars, no soldiers. By the 19th century, the soldier was on the way to becoming the protector, the person who looked after the rest of us, in many ways the noblest part of the state. And you will notice also that women were expected to be involved. And the Levée en Masse was a very definite call to women to take their part in defending the state. Now, women have always been involved in some way or another in war. They have been used as justifications for war. Think of the Trojan Wars. It was the kidnapping of Helen, which apparently started them off. They have been supporters of wars. Women have followed armies to provide food and other supplies. In the 19th century, you began to get women's patriotic associations who organized themselves to buy things for the soldiers and provide medical care. They've also been critics of war. And again, that goes back a very long way. I was looking again at the play, The Trojan Women, which is a tragedy and shows very much how war affects women, and the comedy Lysistrata, which is an attempt by women to prevent war by refusing to have any sexual relations with their husbands until the men stop fighting. The women also, as we know, have been targets of war. Women have been often spoils of war, and increasingly, rape has been used. I would say increasingly because I think we've seen more of it in recent years than as a deliberate weapon of war. Rape has been used as a weapon of war. In the Bosnian War, Serbian nationalists very deliberately sought out Bosnian women, Bosnian Muslim women, and raped them and said to them, "You will now have Serb children. We will force you to bear Serb children." And I think very, very deliberate and dreadful tactic. And increasingly, as I said, women also have been participants in war, moving into the home front. Not so much, I think, as combatants, although that is beginning to change. Up to this point, the majority of fighting, something like 99.8% of all those fighting have been men. But we are now getting more and more examples of women taking part in combat. I think this is partly the result of the changing attitude, again, from subjects to citizens. What also happened, the second big change, was the Industrial Revolution. And what that meant was that a lot of the world, Europe particularly, but those other parts of the world which enjoyed the benefits of the Industrial Revolution became a lot more prosperous, people lived a lot longer, and it was also much easier to kill them on a very large scale indeed. It became possible to have much, much bigger armies. In the old days, the size of your army depended on how much it could eat. And once the army had eaten out everything around it, you had to move on, which naturally limited the size of how many men you could have in uniform. I'll just give you one statistic. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with 600,000 men, the biggest army that Europe had seen to that point. In 1870, the German Confederation invaded France with 1.2 million men. In 1914, Germany had 3 million men in its armies. So a huge increase, and that increase is because it's possible to transport them thanks to railways, it's possible to supply them thanks to factories, it's possible to keep them in the field because you can keep bringing the supplies they need. Your factories can keep as long as they're working, churning out the materials that you need. What it also meant, of course, was that it became possible to kill on a much greater scale. Weapons became deadlier, more accurate, explosives became better, and the range became much longer. You probably all know the expression, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." And that was because in the old-style warfare, up until about the middle of the 19th century, if you were going to fire a musket at someone, you had to be close enough to actually be able to see them face to face. So you had to be, at a maximum, 100 yards away. probably less. By the 1914-1918 war, it was possible to hit someone with a rifle 1,000 yards away. A very, very different matter. It became possible to kill from great distances. Most of the people, the majority of people who died in the First World War were killed by field artillery, which was fired from quite far behind the lines, and sometimes by heavy artillery, which was fired even further. So the casualties begin to go up. In the US Civil War, there were probably 600,000 dead on both sides. And unfortunately, what's also happening in the 19th century is nationalism is becoming a real force in politics. People are organizing themselves on national lines. Countries which were already established, like France, like Britain, began now to feel the same intensity of national feeling. And the danger of nationalism is it almost always has an enemy. And what you got in the 19th century was people saying, we are French. Our natural enemies are over there on the other side of the borders, the Germans. They've always been our enemies. And you're getting the Germans saying exactly the same thing about the French. And that becomes justification for preparations for war. It becomes justification for fearing your neighbor. And fear, I think, does play a very large part in war. But it also becomes justification for killing your enemy. And increasingly, what we see in the 19th century is people beginning to hate not just the soldiers in the field. The soldiers who come into your country, yes, are a menace. They're in uniform, they're going to do something to you, but you begin to hate the whole infrastructure behind them, and that means their societies. You hate their mothers, you hate their fathers, you hate their children. You hate everything that has made them and is keeping them in your country. And this comes out again and again in the rhetoric of the 19th century, the hatred of those who seem menacing you. Perhaps worse in civil wars like the American Civil War. General Sherman, who is, I think, one of the great murderers of history, said, as he rampaged through the South, we are not fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war, as well as their organized armies. And one of the other Union generals in the American Civil War said, the people of the South must be left with nothing but their eyes to weep over. And that, I think, was very, very deliberate policy. And so you get a real change in the nature of war. War, as I think, has always been with us in human society. What you get is a real change in the course of the 19th century, and that really culminates in the Great War between 1914 and 1918, where the resources of these highly sophisticated and organized societies, which have grown in organization and sophistication partly because of the needs to prepare for war, now are turned on each other. And the results, of course, we all know. It was a catastrophe for Europe. It was an event that changed a great deal of the world, which led to the spread of Russian-style Bolshevism. I think highly unlikely that the Bolsheviks would ever have got into power in Russia in 1917 without the First World War. It led to the rise of new powers, the United States in the West and Japan in the East. It led, of course, and this is no doubt a desirable effect, to the weakening of the old European empires. What it also led to was a hope that possibly this time humanity could do something other than war to settle its differences. The catastrophe of the First World War led to the hopes that there would be a new international order and a new way of avoiding war, which was embodied in the League of Nations. The League, I think, was a failure, but an honorable failure. It did not prevent a Second World War, and we got a second and equally dreadful war to the First World War. We are still trying to see how we can deal in a world without war. We're still trying to see how we can avoid war. We still have war with us. Many of us have been very fortunate to live in North America, which has not known war since 1945, but that's not true of many other parts of the world. And we know that there are literally millions, possibly 51 million people in the world who are refugees because of war. And there are wars raging as we speak in Syria, in Afghanistan, in the Great Lakes District, in Africa, and no doubt there will be other ones. Which is why, to come back to the point I started with, we do need to look at war. We do need to understand it. We cannot turn our eyes from it. We need to understand both its appeal to some people, perhaps to more people than we like to think. We also need to understand how and why it happens. Because if we don't, we won't be able to try and deal with or to think about ways trying to avoid it in the future. Thank you.
We now have time for questions. You can go on either side of the aisles to these mics. Please name yourselves and address your questions to Margaret MacMillan. We have about 20 minutes for the exchange. While we are preparing your questions, I have a quick one for our guest. Pourquoi avez-vous choisi ce sujet pour votre carrière? Why war as a topic?
I think partly because I grew up with people talking about the war. My father was in the Canadian Navy, so was my uncle. One of my uncles in the UK was a Lancaster bomber pilot, so we heard about it. But I also, in that generation, knew people in the First World War. Both my grandfathers fought in the First World War. I mean, we're a disappearing generation for obvious reasons. And as children, we had my Canadian grandfather, who was a doctor on the Western Front, brought back a souvenir, as people did. It was a hand grenade. And my grandmother kept it in the curio cabinet. And we used to play with it. It was fun. You could roll it along the floor. And someone noticed, I said, there's still a pin in it. And so it was removed. We no longer rolled it along the floor. But I think it just was there. It was something we talked about. And as an historian, I just am struck by how large a part war has played in the development of our societies and has played in human history. You know, and I think if we ask ourselves what would have happened if the Allies hadn't won the Second World War, which was a close-run thing, closer than we like to think. I mean, we tend to think wars have to end in a particular way, but it didn't have to end like that. What if it had ended another way? We'd be in a very different world. So I think we need to understand it. It just seems to me there's so much there in so many different ways. So.
You know, I have 55 questions, so
you have a lady here.
Would be much better. Monsieur, on this side.
Yes, I think you need the mic to ask a question, so you'll have to come over here. Professor MacMillan, thank you very much for that. That was wonderful. And really, you gave us a very strong sense, and it's partly because of how cool and learned you are of the great monstrousness of war. And I'm a Shakespeare prof, so my thinking about war comes from Shakespeare, but it also comes from contemporaries like Erasmus and Montaigne. And while you gave us a really good account of the monstrousness of war, your account of war also gives us a version of war that is rational all the way down, so that it begins by people defending their territory, defending the sources of their sustenance against others. But someone like Erasmus would say that that is wrong, that war is something we do. It's a beastly thing that humans do. It's not rational in any sense. It's deeply irrational. Montaigne agrees with Erasmus, but makes a very, very different account of it in his essay of The Cannibals, where war is indeed something we do, like dance or poetry, and it is irrational, but from Montaigne's point of view, in that essay, it's also a beautiful thing. And Shakespeare, of course, being as capacious as he is, gives us a sense of war as something beautiful and something monstrous, but also agrees with Erasmus and Montaigne that it is irrational, that there's no rational foundation, even though, as it grows up through time, as you've just told us, it folds in to social formations in ways that are understandable in rational historical terms.
Well, I think it can be both, can't it? I mean, I think people may have very good reasons for fighting. And as far as we know, the early organization of human society did involve protecting what you had against those who would take it. And so those who would take it had to get more organized too, if they wanted to. I mean, you can see, I think there is enough evidence, you can see a growth in the sophistication of nomadic warfare, that they began to develop tactics and strategies which made them more capable. But that doesn't mean that we don't have other reasons for fighting, and I think often cultural factors are very important, how we look at war. I mean, you do have societies in which war is seen as a positive good, and that it is good for young men to fight, and you want those sort of virtues in your societies. And those can change over time. I mean, I don't think there are societies that are condemned to be violent. If you think of the way in which Sweden has changed. I mean, if you were in the 17th century, you wouldn't want the Swedish army anywhere near you. They were vicious, they were dreadful, they were brutal, and you now go to Sweden, people are picking berries in the forest and putting their IKEA things together. So it's very different. So I think it's cultural. I mean, there is a debate about whether it's biological, and that's probably the Hobbesian view. There's a big distinction in Hobbes and Rousseau. Rousseau saying, in a state of nature, we're all rather gentle and kind and deal nicely with each other. And Hobbes would say, no, brutish, nasty, and short. I think the jury is very definitely out on that. I mean, there's been a lot of interesting studies of chimpanzees, who are our nearest cousins in the terms of animal species. And it is true that there are groups of chimpanzees who get together and attack other groups of chimpanzees. But then there are also the wonderful ones, the bonobo chimpanzees, who, I'll spare you the details because it's not really suitable for a family audience, but the bonobos make a great deal of love and no war. And they're very, very different. So I think biologically it's very difficult to say that we are condemned to fight. But I think we have mixed motives, and I think, I try to suggest that the reasons people often fight is because of fear, what others might do. But there are those who really think fighting is a very good thing. But just briefly on Shakespeare, I think Shakespeare is one of the great, I understand so many things, but I think on war he's extraordinary. And I came across a lovely story, and it's very short, I promise, in a memoir of someone fighting in the Burma campaign, and middle-class boy, he had sent some books by his family, and one of the soldiers in his unit came in, who was a miner from Cumbria, really rough character, and said, "What's that you're reading?" He said, "Henry V," and the soldier said, "I'll take it." He said, "You'll never understand it." And the soldier came back 2 days later and said, "That's Shakespeare, he really got it, didn't he? He knew about soldiers," which I think is true, but it does reflect our complicated view. We're not rational beings always, as we know. And I think war is a mixture of the rational and irrational. People think they can use war to achieve a particular end, and they think they can control it. And then, of course, there are all sorts of other things that come into play, and people will fight on, countries will fight on long beyond the point at which they should have stopped.
Thanks, Madame.
I'm going to be way too short for this microphone. I'm just going to make do.
I could hear you.
So I was very interested in your link between development and war, because I'm a gender and development scholar. But what I really wanted to ask you about is your link between nationalism in the people as citizens era and war. And wondering if you have any insights on do you think that nationalism is inherently warlike, or are there means of constructing nationalisms that aren't focused on war and the military?
No, it's a very good question, and the short answer is yes, I do think there are other ways. Mazzini, who was the great advocate of the freedom of nations and nationalism, believed that once nations were independent, Europe would be a more peaceful place, and people would deal as equals with each other, and there would be harmony. But there's another side to nationalism, and nationalism comes in many shapes and forms, but the other side is the one that I think was, certainly in the 19th century, very heavily influenced by social Darwinism. This misapplication of Darwinian theories that you can divide up the human race, as this was the term they would use, the human race into separate species. And so you would have a German species and a French species and an English species. And this was, of course, scientific nonsense, but it was very powerful. And what a lot of nationalists in the 19th century thought was that we are in a Darwinian struggle, and it is the survival of the fittest. And if we don't get them, they're going to get us. And you get a lot of talk, as I referred to just tangentially in my lecture, you get a lot of talk about our hereditary enemies. And so you would get, this is why we have to be careful as university professors, because some of our predecessors have said really dumb things. I think we always have to keep this in mind when we're saying, with great conviction, things. The famous German professor, von Treitschke, who said the Germans have always been, a particular people. They were the only ones ever able to defeat the Romans. It's nonsense. But it was powerful nonsense. And you've got another learned German professor saying the French have always been idle and frivolous and degenerate and haters. And then he said in this wonderful book I read, he said, and I can tell, he said, my readers exactly where to go in Paris to see examples of their degeneracy and frivolity. But this was dangerous because it gave people the sense that they were in a struggle for survival, and then it became a moral thing. Those who don't struggle to survive don't deserve to survive. And war became seen as a positive good. And you got people saying, a nationalism in 1848, which was a sort of moment when nations thought they were breaking free of the old institutions, and in fact that didn't happen in most cases. But in 1848, a German deputy in the Frankfurt Parliament said, "We will only prove that we deserve to be a nation through fighting." And I do think that idea is there, that a nation that truly deserves to exist will fight. And not all nationalisms take that shape, but it was a very powerful idea in the 19th century, and a dangerous one. And it went beyond that. It was often said by men who were well beyond military age, they would say, what we need is a good, healthy bloodletting. What we need is our young men to show that they can actually go off and fight. And that was very, very dangerous indeed. So there is a sort of sense that war is somehow the highest example, the highest exemplar of what a nation truly is. And you're not truly a nation unless you've had a war. So, but not, as I say, not all nationalisms take that forward, but it's there in a lot, I think.
Hey, so I was wondering.
And your name is?
Oh, Ian Kendall. I wanted to ask, given your vast experience in the history of war, given the rise of populist and protectionist sort of sentiments around Europe and North America and many parts of the world these days, how that interacts with the much more globalized economy that we have now, and how you see the conditions that led to World War I and World War II being different or similar to what we are seeing in 2018?
Well, I don't think history ever repeats itself completely, but there are worrying echoes and worrying similarities. And I think before the First World War, it was a very globalized world as well. I mean, we think our world is the most globalized ever, but the period before 1914 was extraordinary in the degree of globalization, and the spread of something like the telegraph, which in its way was as revolutionary as the spread of the internet. The interlocking of economies, the spread of trade, the movements of peoples. I mean, this was an age, really, in some ways, that is very like ours. And a lot of people said at the time, the world's economies are now so interlocked, and in particular the European economies are so interlocked, there's no point fighting. It would be foolish, it wouldn't work, everyone will recognize that. And that's where I'm afraid the irrational side of us as a species comes in. They did fight. In spite of that, Britain and Germany were each other's biggest trading partners. And so they shouldn't have fought, in a way. What good would they get out of it? And of course they didn't get any good out of it, but that didn't stop them from fighting. And so I think that was there. The other thing I find worrying is the rise of populism, because so often populism calls on sort of nationalist myths and nationalist sort of stories to justify itself. We are the only real people in this country. Nobody else is real. And I find very worrying, for example, that Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is now using this language, and so is his party, of we have always fought on the front lines against Islam to defend Christianity. The Western Europeans are so idle and decadent, they don't recognize that we are the noble ones here. And this, it seems to me, is dangerous because it's positing an enemy. And if you start positing an enemy, then sooner or later you're going to get one. And this is what worries me, that looking for an enemy can be very dangerous indeed. And I find very dangerous the sort of language that is now being used, I think both in China and the United States, about how they are going to have to one day fight each other. Because once you start talking like that and planning like that, then you bring it that much closer, it seems to me.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm an undergrad here at the U of R, so please excuse me if my question is dumb.
Sure.
But as you were lecturing, I was thinking about how you're talking about how war has an ability to drive social progress and development. And I was thinking to the present wars that have been fought in my lifetime with Iraq and Afghanistan, and how these wars have become so dependent on technology and how they've been so far removed from the North American experience, with drone warfare making warfare less personal in a way. I'm almost wondering if maybe we're reaching a plateau where the ability of war to drive social progress is maybe becoming, the returns in social progress are diminishing with the effort that we put in? And would the conflicts of the past, such as the Vietnam War and the widespread popular anti-war movement and the ability to depict a war in real time on television, maybe have an impact on that?
No, it's a very good question, and a very complicated one. I don't think, I mean, wars don't start to bring social progress. Just one of the uncomfortable truths about war is they sometimes do. But the cost is absurd. I mean, you wouldn't try and bring about social progress by having a war. But what is happening with war now, I think, is, I think you're right. I think we are, I say we, those of us who are fortunate to live in peaceful zone of the world, the relatively peaceful zone, are very detached from what's happening. Partly because we are fighting with all volunteer armies, armed forces. And so what happened in the First and Second World War is that young men from all over the world were conscripted and went and fought, so experienced war firsthand. And that, I think, made a difference when they came home in various ways. We've sort of farmed out war. We don't see it. We have volunteer soldiers who increasingly, I think, is the case, particularly in the United States, and I think to a lesser extent in Canada, certainly Britain, are coming from particular parts of the country and from particular social groups. So you're almost getting war being, or those who fight war being confined to particular areas and particular social groups, which is not good, I think, for the rest of us in understanding what a war is. Not necessarily good for those who fight the wars, because they may well feel, and I think this is happening, that the civilians just don't understand them, and that we're all idiots, and that's not good. I mean, I think we have to understand each other. What also, I mean, the future of war, I think, is something that we're all sort of wondering about and puzzling about. And what is really difficult is, on the one hand, what we're seeing is low-level civil wars and conflicts which are often have their origins in local divisions that are fueled by outside forces for their own purposes. And I think what's happened in Syria is something that certainly had its origins within Syria, but has been made much worse because of the meddling of outside powers who have their own reasons for wanting to be involved, and outside forces and outside ideologies. But these are wars that drag on with no clear ending. And the victims are those who just happen to be living in those countries. I mean, the losses that the civilian population takes from endless attacks, marauding soldiers, things going wrong, misapplication of force, is absolutely dreadful. And ending such wars is very difficult indeed. The Syrian war, I think, is coming to an end of sorts, but I don't think the misery that the Syrian people have been suffering is going to end anytime soon. I think there's going to continue to be low-level violence, and certainly around the Great Lakes region in Africa, which has already killed, one estimate is 1 million people. We just don't know, because it's very difficult to keep track of what's happening. That war, I think, in its various permutations and combinations, is going to drag on. So we have that kind of fighting on the ground, where a lot of the killing has been done not with particularly high-tech weapons. I mean, Rwanda was done with machetes and hoes. The people are going to continue to die in those sorts of wars, and they'll be overlaid by sometimes great power involvement, and more sophisticated weapons may be used. The other thing that's happening with war is that it's moving into different dimensions. Drones are being used more and more, and I think this is a very dangerous development. If you really want to give yourself nightmares, there's a YouTube video on killer robots, which I can recommend. Which is really, it's terrifying, because these are going to be little killing machines, often tiny, you hardly be able to see them, and they'll sort of zip in here and knock us all out in 2 seconds. Just to cheer you up. So that, I think, is worrying. And of course, there's now the whole cyber war dimension that, we have allowed, and it's happened without anyone planning it, we've allowed our societies to become extremely dependent on electronic communications. And there is already the capacity that different nations and different groups have developed to knock them out. An electromagnetic war, if you knock out all the electronic communications in Regina, means the lights would go out here, our phones wouldn't work, we wouldn't know where we were, we wouldn't be able to get home. Things like water wouldn't work, so that I think we are more vulnerable than we like to think. So there are new dimensions of war. We think about the drones and the robots, but it's the cyber war as well, and the possibility of our whole sort of communications network being knocked out is absolutely terrifying. I'm sorry, this is not the subject for a nice sunny day, so I apologize.
We'll take time for 2 quick questions and an answer to the 2 questions taken together. So we had 2 people on this side, so go rapidly, and Dr. MacMillan.
Thank you so much for that. My question's actually quite similar to the one that was just posed. So maybe just one extra little thing that I had. I mean, I was going to ask about your perspective on the future of warfare and the direction that it will take in terms of its form, but which I think we just kind of discussed with drone warfare and technological advances and things like that. But one thing in particular that I was interested by was you very nicely summarize this transition from subject to citizen, and I was wondering if you can identify a similar kind of transition or metamorphosis in terms of the form of warfare from a kind of Schmittian sense to something else that has become mobile or guerrilla warfare or things like that. So if there's a particular moment that you can identify or...
Thank you. My name is Jean-Michel. I have a short question. I would be interested to hear you what you think about the actual studies on international history of law and the argument that since the middle of the 19th century, the international attempt to limit war or to making the war illegal was some kind of succeed. I'm thinking about like Israel all on German army or Hannah Hathaway and the recent book of Shakespeare, The Internationalism. So, thank you.
Well, both very good questions and not easy to answer briefly, but I'll do my best. I think war is always changing, and it changes partly because of the nature of those fighting, but it also changes because of the technology. And what was happening in the 19th century was that the power that the defense could exert was increasing significantly. And so, in other words, it's becoming much more difficult to attack the defended position. And that was a combination of the greater range of the weapons. It was a combination of new innovations. Even just loading your gun lying down meant you're no longer a target. It was very difficult to hit someone if you couldn't see him, usually him. Trenches, the humble shovel, barbed wire, these all made it much more difficult to attack. If you try and run across a field 1,000 yards with people shooting at you, you are probably not going to get very far. And of course, if you try and prepare the attack by using artillery, you chop up the field so much that you can't run across it. And so the technology, briefly, and for a period, made it very difficult to attack. And there was also a problem. The military simply were not adapting to it. What the military said is we just need more enthusiasm, we need them to run a bit faster, we need more motivation, we need more soldiers, we just have to accept we're going to have more losses if we attack. But it wasn't all their fault. I mean, it was also technology. And of course, in the end, that changed. By the time of the Second World War, the airplane and the tank and the combustion engine generally made it possible for armies to move a lot quicker. And you couldn't, if you did hide in a trench, an airplane could fall over and drop something on you. So it changed. And I think we will see this change going on. And the military, in a way, are always scrambling to catch up, because they spend a lot of time and effort training their soldiers and their sailors and their airmen to fight a particular kind of war, and then suddenly the technology changes. But also the type of war they're fighting. I mean, the Americans made the mistake, I think, in fighting in Vietnam by trying to fight a conventional ground war. They eventually adapted and learned to fight a counterinsurgency war, learned to deal with small units and learned to deal with it better. When that war ended, which they felt they lost, they decided they'd forget about it and never fight counterinsurgency again, so they had to relearn it all over again. So how you fight wars is a combination of what's available to fight with and also who's doing the thinking about it. On the attempts to make peace, I think this is really important. And what you get into it's been there throughout human history. I mean, you always had conventions. The Greeks had conventions that when they had a battle, they would reach the end of the day and they'd say, well, pretty much it looks like this side's won, and they'd stop and they'd pick up the wounded from the field and they'd pick up their things and they'd go home. But in the 19th century, we got, I think, as the world became more interlinked, we got a real attempt to build international law, international institutions, international norms, and that attempt goes on. You know, and I think it's a very, very important attempt. And I think what I find striking, you know, for all the wars we've had since 1945, we still have had those making those wars, trying to justify them in terms of law. We're doing it, we're fighting a legal war. Now that doesn't mean they're fighting a nice war, but I think we all recognize that war is something that we would prefer to control, prefer to get rid of if we possibly can. And of course the stakes are much higher now because the possibility of a war now could do far more damage than I think any of us could possibly imagine. You know, if we had an all-out war, who knows? I mean, you think of the damage of the Second World War, with the weapons we have now, that would be negligible compared to what we can do to ourselves now. And so I think the attempt must be made, it continues to be made, but that's, and again, I guess I go back to my earlier point, that's why it's so important to study it.
History of war, a serious topic. Merci beaucoup, Madame MacMillan.